Hi everybody, welcome to Consent in Long-Term Relationships. This workshop's part of our Healthy Relationships and Healthy Intimacy series. So a little bit about me. My name's Angel. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a certified sex educator and I have a master's in counseling psychology. This workshop was developed by me for ASPEC, which is Advocating for Sex Positive Education and Consent Culture, a nonprofit in Alberta that's currently working on establishing federal charity status. We do offer services across the country. Before we begin, I just want to talk a little bit about what is safe spaces, as we're going to be engaging in some discussions. So safe space for us is just zero tolerance to like bigotry, aggression, other hateful behaviors. There is a big difference between that and a mistake. In this space, if someone says something that just isn't in line with our safer space policy and it was likely a mistake, we'll correct them by going, hey, we don't say that here because, with the assumption that you intended no harm and you would want the information. We'd ask that you assume we meant no harm by offering the correction, and that works in the reverse as well. You can let us know. I know it says to email Nix, but Nix is no longer with us, so you can email myself, Angel, or Theo, Theo. We've found that this safer space thing is like the easiest way for people to move on, learn, and be able to take in information even when it's uncomfortable. So let's start with what consent is. Consent is, this is a dictionary definition. Before we talk about ways that we can modify this definition to be a better reflection of how consent can be embodied, let's watch this little video here.
We should talk.
I want to talk about
We need to talk about consent.
Which may seem hard.
It's not really everybody's favorite subject.
It's not really a sexy word.
I don't feel like I used a lot.
Like we're getting something notarized.
It sounds very formal.
Sign here, here, and here.
Something you hear in the news.
But we should be talking about it.
Because this
And initial 3 times here.
is the wrong way to think about it.
Consent is more than just a legal term.
It's not a box to check or something to get out of the way.
It's about respect and listening.
It's communicating openly.
And it's how to have good sex.
I'd like to talk about that.
Really good sex.
I vote we talk about that.
And we will. But first, let's get some things clear.
Consent means you have ownership over your own body.
You have agency.
All the time.
And nothing can ever change that.
Not what you wear, not what you've been drinking.
Not where you are or what time it is.
Nothing.
Consent is something you own and share.
And you always have the right to choose what you share.
Just because you give consent to one thing doesn't mean that somebody has full reign of your body.
And you can always change your mind.
If you don't like what's happening anymore, it's perfectly fine to stop.
Peace out. Gotta go.
You don't owe anyone anything.
And it's okay to say no to some things and yes to others.
Communicating ensures that everybody is safe and feels respected.
It's also the key to great sex.
Because sex should be good.
And good sex is great.
Like really, really great.
You feel good about it the next day
Clouds opening up.
and the day after that.
And you're completely in tune with the other person.
I'll do that again. I'll do that again right now.
So, how do we do that?
How do you know you have consent?
You gotta pay attention.
Sometimes it's verbal.
Yes.
No.
Those are pretty clear cut.
Sometimes it's physical. You're really vibing with someone.
Returning loving touches.
Guiding each other.
Reciprocating.
Communicate with your partner.
Or partners.
Right. Communicate with them about what you like or don't like.
How are you feeling? How are they feeling?
Do they seem conflicted, uncomfortable, or tense, or even scared? Check in.
And if you're not sure, ask.
Is this okay?
Can I do this?
If not, they'll be glad you asked.
Because that's kind of sexy, actually.
Help your partner by being clear about your consent as well.
I don't want that.
Why don't we try something else?
Let's stop.
You don't have to feel shy or worried about what they'll think.
No one wants to have bad sex.
So guide them, let them know what you like.
And if you don't know, you could find out together.
Being open and building trust can help you try new things.
And new things can be very fun.
Ask him.
Ask her.
Ask them.
And listen.
If you take care of them, they can take care of you.
And it's pretty nice to be taken care of.
Consent is mutual communication.
If it's not mutual, or if your partner cannot communicate,
Actively.
Because they're asleep or passed out.
If they're intoxicated or high,
Then that's not consent.
End of story.
Your standards for sex can and should be higher than just not a felony.
find out what consent means to you and your partner.
know what you need to feel comfortable. and to enjoy sex.
Make sure your partner respects that.
And that you respect your partner.
Consent is not just a question of legality.
Not just who has permission to do what.
It's the basis for a healthy and happy sex life.
Whether you're having sex or not.
And it's okay if you are.
And it's okay if you're not.
Everybody's okay.
The only thing that's not okay is someone else making that choice for you.
If you have any questions,
If you feel like you're in a gray area,
Or to learn how NYU defines consent.
You can go to nyu.edu/sexual-respect.
Or check out the Center for Sexual Misconduct Support Services.
Let's talk about consent.
Because we have to.
Because we need to.
And because we want to.
All right. Back to this one. So that just gives us a basic idea of what consent can look like in a relationship when we're not just looking like, what do I have to do to not go to jail? But instead, what do I have to do to have an incredibly wonderful time with my partner or partners? This model is based on the Fry's model by Planned Parenthood. Hang on. Apparently I have sound going in the background here. There we go. It wouldn't be a real presentation without at least one technical issue. So the Fry's model is freely given. The person doesn't feel like they have to say yes. They don't feel like they can't say no. It's reversible, meaning they can change their mind at any point in time. They can do this verbally by saying no more, stop, I changed my mind, but they can also do it non-verbally by changes in their body language. Consent is informed, so the person knows exactly what they're agreeing to. And in this model, it's also enthusiastic. So not a reluctant consent, or they're not agreeing just to avoid other issues, because then consent wouldn't be valid. And of course, it's specific. Just because somebody agrees to do something with one person, they're not agreeing to do it with another person. If they agree to do something in one space, they're not agreeing to do it in another, etc. Does this match your behavior in long-term relationships? Does it match your expectations? What kind of challenges do you see this presenting in a long-term relationship? So some of the challenges that I've heard people talk about are things like, I don't want my partner asking me every time. So I get that, and I even understand why, but I would challenge you to think about why you don't want your partner to ask every time. And if you were asked to just put your hands on someone and constantly assume, and you never really knew if they were okay, how would that feel? And so some of the things that come up around this are that we do live in a society that shames us around our sexual interests, our sexual behaviors. And also, it's hard to navigate this stuff all the time. We're taught we should be having a certain amount of sex in our long-term relationships, that by not wanting to have sex, we're somehow abusing our partners, that if we just start having sex, then we'll want more sex. Like, there's all these really complex messages. And especially in heterosexual relationships, there can be a lot of one-sided asking and one-sided permission giving. When we start reframing things, it's going to take some time to get used to it and to learn how to navigate that, but you will find that the trust intimately built, which means you can enjoy more interesting things. You can talk about things that maybe you couldn't talk about before. Also, sometimes it can be a problem because people might have gotten comfortable with the way the consent works in the relationship, and it's weird to change it, right? So some things that we can look at are, have I established consent in my long-term relationship? Do my partner or partners honor my bodily autonomy? What sort of expectations are there regarding my body or my partner's body? What boundaries are blurred in the name of compromise or relationship building? And is there harm being experienced because of this? And how many of our disagreements come from one of us feeling disrespected, less considered, less honored? Do any of those come from not seeing the other as an individual with a full right for decision making? How else is consent being impacted in my long-term relationship? And how do these challenges intersect with consent? These are just some of the questions that have come up in previous classes quite frequently. Some points that we can expand on is the expectations in long-term relationships aren't necessarily there in hookup culture, like availability, like the link between sex and demonstrating you care. These things don't come up in hookup culture, but they do come up in a long-term relationship where it's almost as if we've had this idea pushed on us in our very colonial society that part of the benefit of having a long-term relationship is to have access to somebody we can just have sex with all the time. And once we start to look at it that way, how could we not have the expectation that we're supposed to look after our partner's sexual needs, or they ours? Has anybody, for example, set aside a night where they dressed up with the expectation that things would end in romantic activities? Now, this isn't about judging. Like, this is normal stuff in our society. This is what we're taught to do. Spice up your love life. Greet them at home wearing lingerie, right? Take them out for fancy dinners that you could have like wild sex that night. But those are expectations. And when we feel those expectations, it can be harder to say no, or to set a boundary, or to be honest about how we're even feeling about things. So let's talk about where these ideas of consent comes from. One of the things that people have noted in previous classes that impacts the way they look at consent are gender roles. What were you taught growing up about what your role in a long-term relationship would be when it comes to intimacy? Where did you get those messages from? And do they actually match the roles that you feel connected with? Because I've met people who are not connected and people who are, Yes, try and talk about it without judgment. And that's a little harder. It's like, just notice it, observe it. That's interesting. Right? So when does compromise become a lack of consent? So we're just going to take a look at this. Right. So looking at this article, I'm just gonna like kind of skim it here and give you like the brass tacks. This author is talking about how sex when you've been together for a year is a lot different when you've only been together for 3 months. And at 3 months, it's a lot different than it was the very first time. We get used to the person that we're in a relationship with. We get to know what they like. They get to know what we like. We're used to their rhythms. They're used to ours. And so it's really easy to know what buttons to press, and we might start to just kind of get a little too comfortable, right? And then maybe we have different sex drives. Maybe our sex drive has changed over time, and theirs hasn't changed with us. Maybe one person is starting to figure out that a lot of their sex interests come from pressure and they're not actually intrinsically rewarded by certain types of touch. They might start figuring out they're asexual, for example. So when does that compromise actually become a lack of consent? Because this is like a really complex issue. Like, it's really easy if someone feels threatened by the other person, that's really easy. It's like, oh, well, that's obviously not consent. But there is a pressure inherent in our culture in relationships. And you only feel it if you're on the wrong side of it. We don't feel it when we're the ones. Yeah. I'm sorry for anybody watching the recordings. We edit out what people are saying in the discussions because otherwise the discussions aren't authentic because people know they're being recorded. So you have to have your own discussions at the fore. Right, so we might want to check in with our partners on occasion and be like, hey, I make a lot of assumptions. How are you feeling with that? Like, let's talk about that, right? Because we're only going to notice that pressure when we're the one feeling that pressure. When it's like, oh, I know they're going to come home and they're going to expect this. That's not a good feeling. And so how do we deal with that? It's also really important to remember that anything less than an enthusiastic yes equals a no. So give the article a read. There's a couple others in your handouts that you could take a look at as well. They're super important. But the article talks about how we might want to compromise and like give sex to a partner to develop other benefits in the relationships, right? How would you feel if you found out your partner was agreeing to have sex with you as a compromise for the relationship, not because they enjoyed it or wanted to? Because when we think about it in that context, it kind of changes how we might respond to the first part of, you know, is it okay to like just give your partner sex? You don't have to say your answers out loud or in the forum either, just to be clear. What type of contact would you be comfortable in compromising in? What wouldn't you be? And that's a very personal decision, and it can change from one situation to another over our lifespan during a relationship. There is no right answer to this. Okay, but there are impacts in relationships when bodily autonomy isn't respected. And there's been a lot of studies at looking at how consent enacted in long-term relationships and the different outcomes based on different levels of active consent built into those relationships can play out. Researchers found that trust is rooted in relationships where consent is not an active part of intimacy. A lack of trust, sorry. Right? They noticed that the resentment is higher in couples that didn't openly talk about sex in a way that included setting boundaries, respecting and navigating consent. They also found that it was counterintuitive to not openly discuss sexual boundaries. People who felt like their bodily autonomy was not being respected also indicated a decrease in intimacy. Interesting, right? There's also some physical impacts were noted. What other things can you think about that could occur in a relationship? And what experiences are you open to sharing on how assumptions and a lack of open communication about sex that includes consent can have on your relationship? Amazing, everybody. Okay, as we move forward in developing our skills to bring consent into our long-term relationship, just note there is hope. We do have some resources and handouts for developing compassion for ourselves and others. And some of these handouts deal with shame, others deal with self-esteem, but it all boils down to being able to recognize that all of us are just doing the best we can with the information we have. Our experiences and culture does shape us. And once we become aware of the biases we hold, the ideas that we have, that's when we can start challenging those ideas and working on improvements as needed. We're also including some resources and handouts on relearning our own boundaries and what our partner's boundaries are. This is vital. If you're going to have open discussions about what does and does not feel comfortable, what does and does not interest us, what does and does not cause harm, we can't identify what we're okay and not okay with unless we do that work, right? We're not going to be able to explain to our partner if we can't recognize it ourselves. It can be a lot of work. It can be challenging and embarrassing to talk to our partners about sex and intimacy. So we're also including some resources and homework assignments to develop that emotional safety in your relationship. That's something that has to be done with the cooperation of your partner or partners. There's also resources on how to communicate your boundaries, how to navigate your boundaries, and various other worksheets for building up consent. Just a reminder that these changes are not going to happen overnight. We need to start with small things that are easier to navigate rather than jumping in bed and expecting all these tools just bang, snap into place, right? That means practicing checking in over non-sexual contact as well. Practice our negotiating skills and our boundary setting with things that feel less intense. Practice rolling with a no in situations that are less stressful. Thoughts? Questions? Okay, so some of you have heard me talk about this think, ask, listen. This is our consensual framework. It sounds simple, right? What the framework does do, though, is require a lot of practice. We want to start by really thinking about what it is we want to approach our partner with. What is our intent? Are we thinking about our gratification, or are we thinking about mutual gratification? Is this a gift that doesn't involve our own gratification? Like, how does this work? Even taking into consideration the boundaries that they've set before, right? We need to be thinking, like, what have they said before? Am I pushing against something where they've said no? We want to approach this with a chance of it being something that's mutually beneficial. So are we? Or is this something that doesn't have a chance of being mutually beneficial? We also need to be prepared that they just might not want to do whatever it is we're thinking about, and that has to be okay. It needs to be okay. We need to go at it with curiosity instead of expectations. we might want to make sure that we're asking questions in a way that invites them to share their feedback rather than insinuating that we expect a yes. And we can do that with open-ended questions and also by taking contextual clues and setting the scene. So we don't want to wait until we're in bedroom naked and then be like, hey, how about anal, right? Instead, we want to be doing something where we aren't in a situation where we feel vulnerable and be like, hey, like, are you open to a conversation about like some sex stuff? Like, here's some things I'm curious about. How do you feel about those? What do you think about that? How does that sound to you? Those are open-ended questions. Would you be interested in that? Is there anything you'd like to change in that? Going, I want this, okay, is not an open-ended question. Considering steps 1 and 2, if you want to ask your partner if they're interested in a quickie, how could you phrase that in an open-ended question? Excellent. Now we need to listen to the response and to be absolutely certain that we understand the response. That means not just listening with our ears, but with our eyes too, and considering the context. Was their body closed off even while they said yes? Were their words shy, but their body is indicating excitement? If you're unsure, what can you do to be sure that you are understanding their response? And for those who are listening to the recording, so what this looked like was something like, hey, I'd be really curious to like start when we're picking anal, just because it's one of those things that gets talked about. I'm really curious in exploring anal. Like, is that something you'd be interested in? Right? And now when they respond to us, we can repeat back what we think we understood. So what you're saying is, while you are also curious, you'd want a lot more information before you'd feel comfortable proceeding with anything like that. Or if we're getting mixed messages, right? I hear your words sound like agreement, but your body doesn't look like you're excited about it. Like, what's going on for you? I noticed you moved away from me while you answered. Is that just because you're embarrassed? Or are you saying yes because you're not sure it's okay to disagree with me? Like, what's going on? Right? So now say I wanted to ask you to go for coffee, right? So, hey, do you want to go for coffee with me? Or if I said, it would be really cool if sometime we went for coffee together, how do you feel about that? Would you be interested in going for coffee with me sometime? And if I was to be like, yeah, I guess we could go for coffee. Does that sound like an enthusiastic yes? And we're going to watch a video about that later too. So what do you folks think? Like, did that message sound like a yes? How confident would you be to just assume that that was a yes? So I'm going to ask some harder questions now, so I'll just give you a little bit of warning. What are some of the reasons why someone might say something with their mouth that they're not saying with the rest of their body or their tone of voice? So quite often, someone might not feel safe to say no. They might not realize that it's okay to say no. They might feel pressure. They might be worried about how you're going to react. They can be thinking about that compromise we were talking about. I want my relationship to be good, so I'm just going to say yes. Right? Why is it important that we talk about that and recognize what enthusiastic consent does include and doesn't include? Yeah, we want to make sure that we're doing things that our people are comfortable with us doing. Not just doing things because they know we want to. And vice versa, right? We need to be able to roll with a no. And that can be really complicated. We're often taught that someone refusing to do something with us is actually a rejection of us. It symbolizes like a lack of affection or a punishment. It might help to consider that rejection isn't actually about us. It's about that person, what they're feeling in the moment, their own experiences. And it can be really helpful to remember that the reason we want an enthusiastic yes is so that we can be 100% certain that the things we are doing are mutually beneficial, rather than pressuring someone into doing something that makes them unhappy. So I'm actually grateful when somebody feels comfortable enough to tell me no. I feel better about yeses when somebody is comfortable telling me no. I'm not sure is a no, shrugging is a no, anything but like a fuck yes is a no. So when you tell someone no, what kind of responses would make you feel most comfortable? For those watching the recording, some of the things that people came up with were things like, thank you for letting me know, I appreciate that. If you change your mind, you can let me know, I won't bring it up again. Things like that. And responses that can make a person feel terrible, what came up in our group discussions were things like, oh, that's right, nobody ever wants to do anything with me. Well, what about those 100 times I did things that I didn't want to do? Oh, I suppose you don't love me anymore. Oh, come on, honey, please. Right? So now we can practice rolling with a no. Get somebody you trust and just practice asking them to go on a date. And when they say no, even if it's a soft no, so not a verbal no, but no in other ways, you can practice just being like, hey, I can see that you're not comfortable with that idea. If you ever change your mind, let me know. And walk away. If we do get a fuck yes, there's important things to remember. We want to make sure that that consent is ongoing by checking in, watching their body language, and stopping if they stop reciprocating or look uncomfortable, and then checking in. Imagine you're making out, your partner stops for a moment, looks at you. Are you okay? Do you need to stop? Think about how that would feel. Would you be okay to say that you needed to stop? Now imagine you're making out and your partner does not stop what they're doing, but while still doing it goes, hey, are you okay? Do you need to stop? How does that feel to think about telling them you need to stop? There isn't like right or wrong answers here either. We do need to consider what we need to feel safe telling our partner something is wrong or up during sex. And they also need to know what they need to feel to be safe to tell us to stop. We can't assume that we're comfortable and that they're comfortable and that we can meet everybody's needs. If we have that enthusiastic yes, just a reminder, we're going to check in. If our partner stops, makes sounds we're unsure of, if their body language changes, we need to keep those boundaries in mind. So when we asked and listened to the response, we did this so we can act in a way that's respectful. Did they say yes to one thing and not another? We need to not do the thing that they said no to. We need to only do the things that they said yes to, as long as they look and say that they're consensually engaged throughout. We don't even want to add something that we thought was covered under the agreement but wasn't explicitly talked about. That's called negotiating up. We don't want to increase the vulnerability once things get going. When somebody's in that trusting, vulnerable state, we don't want to add anything, because that can feel like you were tricked. It feels non-consensual. Even if it ends up being something they really enjoyed, it can feel unsafe. So if we want the joy of consensual mutual pleasure, we have to be able to speak up clearly about what we want, be okay hearing about what our partner wants, even if they don't line up. We need to be able to hear about limits and to set limits, to navigate sex as a joint experience rather than an act of pursuing and giving in. So there's a whole bunch of resources in the handouts for you to take a look at. I have worksheets for all of these building consent tools. If you need them to be emailed, if you're having troubles downloading them, you can reach me at angel@aspect.ca. Okay. Thank you so much for coming out, everybody.